Thanks everybody for joining. Just one quick note. We're going to do a poll shortly after folks introduce themselves, and it's in the Vegas app. So if you have that, just open it up, go to our session, and then midway down the page you'll see live poll. So once we get to that, then you can vote, and we can see the results. So with that said, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Alexia on the end.
Hi, my name is Alexia Surkov. I'm a partner at Deloitte. I've been there for about 22 years now. My current role is that I co-lead our Libor transition services work. Another hat that I wear is I run our financial instrument pricing and modeling and model risk management practice, both in the US and globally. And from an industry perspective, I co-chair one of ARC's working groups on operations and infrastructure, very relevant to the technology-focused discussion that we're having today, so thank you.
Hey, good morning. Eli Stern, a partner at Ernst & Young. I co-lead our securitization practice at Ernst & Young based out of New York. I also lead our financial services blockchain practice as well. Ernst & Young as a firm is very focused on Libor. We're doing a lot of work with our clients on helping them with the transition, working with all of the industry groups. So very excited to be part of this panel. I think it's a very relevant discussion for the industry, and looking forward to a good discussion. And thank you for everyone to showing up on the last day for I think what is the last or second to last panel.
Hi, I'm Harry Lippmann. I'm with Bloomberg. I've been here at Bloomberg for about close to 20 years now. Before that, a proprietary trader. I guess you could say I'm a global derivatives product manager in derivatives and fixed income derivatives. And I guess the first 10 years or so, I've been focused on building out the analytics for both the credit and the interest rate platform. I'd say the last 10 years, especially after the credit crisis, been more heavily involved in changes of practice and in valuation and other outcomes of the credit crisis, credit counterparty risk, CCP margin work, and more recently, over the last 5 years, we've been heavily involved in Libor transition. So we're managing that and multiple threads in that space, and we'll talk about that in a little while.
Hi, my name is Ola Hanoun Kassa, and I'm from Moody's Investor Service. I lead the US RMBS surveillance team, and my team is heavily involved in the Libor working group within Moody's. Part of that working group is to assess exposure across the structured finance portfolio that we monitor, as well as corresponding with the market and keeping updated with the development on the Libor transition. As of now, we are estimating about $700 billion of bonds that will be outstanding by the time Libor goes away in 2021. And so there's a lot of work and lots of projects that need to be completed by then.
Hi, I'm Dominic Brown. I am the field technology head at Intralinks, so I manage our team of solution architects, and I also lead our compliance solution team, and we focus on helping banks share, collaborate, distribute highly confidential information with focus areas on Libor transition, anti-money laundering, and subpoena response. And I've been in Intralinks for about 5 years.
So I'm Link Finkenberg. I'm a partner at Perkins Coie. Before joining, I was at BNY Mellon, where I ran the machine learning group over contracts, as well as covered our investment services businesses. I'm just going to maybe take a pause here. Maybe we could put the polling question up. All right, well, when the AV, oh, are you trying to put it up?
There we go.
Okay, great. So the question is, how ready do you feel your organization is for Libor's cessation? So feel free to vote, and we'll give you a minute or two. Yeah, no luck?
Caucus style.
All right, well, maybe with a show of hands, I mean, how involved are your shops with getting ready for the transition to LIBOR? Very prepared? Getting there, okay. So I'll give maybe just a real quick recap on LIBOR. So obviously LIBOR is going away at the end of 2021. It's going to have a widespread impact on various different financial instruments, certainly debt, derivatives, the loan market, et cetera. There are various industry working groups who are looking at, the transition, fallback language. Obviously, firms are deeply involved in, assessing their book, et cetera. And maybe with that said, I can swing this over to, maybe I'll start with
Sure.
you, Dominic, and you can talk a little bit about the tech tool that you guys are using
Sure.
to help firms sort of get on top of their contracts.
Yeah, so what we're primarily focused on at Intralinks is helping banks repaper contracts that expire after December 2021. So working with a few banks and helping them, but we're seeing some patterns. And to this repapering process, essentially there's really three high-level phases. There's discovery, amendment, and then customer sign-off, client sign-off. And what we're also seeing is really sort of an assembly line approach to this, right? So if you start with discovery, what banks are doing is they're reusing existing e-discovery tools to find these contracts, collect these contracts, and then do a triage, essentially rule in, rule out contracts that reference LIBOR that expire after December 2021. It sounds simple, but it's actually a big job. We had one customer that had contracts in 28 different repositories that they needed to collect. When they finally collected them, culled them, there was over 1 million contracts. So the upfront culling is important in that the less information, the more information culled up front, the less money spent on lawyers and AI contract review tools downstream in the process, right? So a tool like Kira or Knowable can be like $5 to $20 per contract. You cull out 100,000 contracts and the ROI is significant. Also with this stage, metadata is pulled out of these documents for classification purposes and workflow purposes. So the assembly line process sort of kicks in here as these contracts come out of this discovery phase. They are ingested into secure collaboration tools. And what these tools do is they centralize, secure, and stage these contracts for internal and external review teams. And those review teams, depending upon the amount of contracts, can either be manually provision these contracts or automatically provision these contracts. If there's a big number of contracts, like a million contracts, you're going to want to essentially automate that process.
So I guess the idea is there's a common platform, so multiple constituencies
That's
can
right.
work on the contract.
Precisely.
Whether it's diligencing
Yep.
and then later,
Yeah.
as the lawyers or other folks who need to kind of have input can sort of access that common platform.
Exactly, and it acts as a hub, right? So the contract review tools like Kira and Noble will integrate with that to facilitate that amendment process. And this secure collaboration tool will manage the encryption. It'll encrypt each document in transit at rest, and it'll also track everything so you can then defend your process
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I don't know, Eli, are you seeing certain
Yeah, I mean, I
tools that
think
are being deployed
It
out
sounds
there?
like we're doing something similar. So we have developed a tool that uses, and it sounds like you may have also, that uses robotics, OCR, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to help with identifying contracts, data extraction, and ultimately the repapering of the contracts. And I think, when you think about robotics and OCR, there's sort of a wide range of how it can
Sure.
how it can be used. It can be used in its somewhat more simpler form of just identifying key terms or words like LIBOR, right, and pulling the contracts that have those terms in them. On the more advanced end, we've been able to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify and interpret actual language in contracts, and then compare, and actually understand them and then compare them to benchmark language that we have in, or language that we have in benchmark contracts, and then help sort of categorize the contracts in order of, you know, how badly they need to be
Right.
amended and whether they or not they need to be amended. You know, I think a big component of the repapering process is also, once you've identified everything that needs to be repapered, is engaging with the counterparties,
Right.
right? Because, you know, at the end of each contract is at least one other counterparty. And when you're talking about, you know, loans and things like that, those number of counterparties becomes voluminous.
That's right.
So it's coming up with a process for doing that as well. And then also, depending on the quality of the original contracts, you also need to have some level of manual intervention, and your tool has to be able to identify, you know, and come up with a certain degree of confidence whether or not it's interpreted the language correctly, and let you know whether you need to bring in someone for human intervention.
Yeah. So it sounds like scoping, figuring out what you have, how good, bad, or ugly, really, the language is, and then based on that, what do you need to do in order to, in essence, remediate, which in some cases will be an amendment.
And also standardizing your approach and your interpretation of terms and contracts across the enterprise. So essentially, publishing everything into some sort of accessible database or eRoom or something that everybody can access, and sort of making sure everyone's following the same marching orders in terms of accessing them.
Are you encountering a lot of images? Is that why you're doing the OCR?
Yeah, I mean, well, also just it's the OCR and the robotics is just the fastest way that we can get through it all.
Just get through the text,
yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to take a step back, the idea is the OCR allows you to ingest what is sort of a hard copy of a document.
Right.
That makes it sort of editable, searchable.
Right.
And also, the machine learning needs to go on top of a textual format, and then from there, you've got the ability, after training, et cetera, to sort of isolate provisions that will help you at least get to the right area.
Yeah.
So I see, Alexia, you had a...
Yeah, I think the folks in the room might have a question as to, you know, why we need so much OCR or robotics or automation to do this, and you know, even like, why do we even need to go to the paper contracts? And you know, we do a lot of similar work to what Elia described, and also have some tools both internally developed as well as partner with a variety of tools, some of which were present here at this conference that do this sort of AI-enabled discovery. But the question I get sometimes is like, why do you even need to do that? I kind of know what my Libor contracts are. And you know, the simple answer is that you may know what your contracts are, but you may not always know all the nuances in those contracts that are relevant to the repapering. So for example, you know, somewhere in your systems you probably have a flag that says, here are all of my Libor-based loans. So that's probably true. You don't need to do OCR to find that out. But chances are that nowhere in your systems do you have another field that says, and by the way, if Libor goes away, here is the rate to which this contract will default based on, you know, page number 342 in the prospectus, right? So that information was never captured in systems in a systematic way, and so what we're finding is that a lot of times you have to go to the original contract, sometimes to a scanned version, sometimes even to paper contracts, to try to figure out what is it that we said would happen to this contract if Libor goes away. This isn't, you know, this isn't something that anybody had really anticipated doing, and so, you know, discovering that and then merging that information into the database that you already have of your contracts and your exposures and your data is really one of the tasks here.
Yeah.
One other thing, just from a technology standpoint, we've been sort of thinking about technology in sort of two buckets. The first one is the one that we're talking about, technology that you can use to facilitate the transition. And secondly, the impact that the transition will have on existing technology, which is huge. I think the overall cost to large global institutions for this transition is estimated to be around $400 million. As you go down to somewhat smaller financial institutions with offer less products, it's around 100 to 200 million, and then smaller banks, it's around 50 to 100 million, with technology being around 32% of that.
Yep.
And that's not counting the repapering, which is another 18%. So you're talking, you know, of those hundreds of millions of dollars, you're talking 50% of that
Yeah.
at least being driven by tech,
Yeah.
by tech. So it's a big deal. It's really something you got to think about.
Yeah, and just getting back to Alexi's point around looking at your documents, I've had clients where I've explained what are in these documents, not necessarily theirs per se, if they haven't looked at them, and they're often shocked that there's language in there that can be as difficult as it is. You know, just as an aside, if you go into Edgar, and I recently did this myself, there were in excess of 100 pooling and servicing agreements where a party you would never expect had the obligation to swap out a rate, had that obligation, and that's a big deal. You know, there's a lot of liabilities associated with an obligation like that, and it's something you definitely want to be on top of. So, you know, like a lot of big institutions, people come and go, contracts get negotiated, so the terms will be pretty diverse, and sometimes actually more diverse than folks had anticipated. So anyway, maybe I can turn it over to you here. I know you guys are working on some interesting aspects at Bloomberg with Libor and making information available.
Everything we're working on at Bloomberg is absolutely interesting. I'm assuming my manager is listening to my words here. So just to almost drill up the conversation just a touch, I feel like we've sort of did a deep dive quickly to some of the discovery, some of the paperwork, repapering, et cetera. If you kind of drill up, I mean, we have over 300,000 customers around the world on the terminal, and some are Libor users in a more casual sense. You know, someone trading an FX forward that, you know, discounts his cash flows by Libor. And then, of course, you have the opposite extreme. You have, you know, advanced derivative traders that are already trading RFR or OIS or Libor or various tenors of Libor. You have your huge asset managers, the PIMCOs and Citadels of the world that have, you know, cash securities hedged with interest rate swaps. So kind of the first major thread you could think of is curves and quotes, and where do some of these things trade, these RFRs, overnight rates and indicative swap transactions that allow you to project the forwards. So even though there's no official forward term fixing just yet on SOFR and some other OIS around the world, there are certainly indications of where you can make a market on a 3-month forward, a 1-year forward, et cetera, et cetera. Also keeping up with new issuance for FRNs that are coming through now over the last year based on SOFR and these other OI or RFRs. We're certainly keeping up with new issuance and adding calculators for both FRNs and loans and things like that that can handle this new compounding convention and so on. Then you kind of go to the next thread, and I promise I'll stop at some point, but you go on to the next thread, which is fallback language, which I think to some extent some of the conversation's already touching on. You have your spectrum of securities, whether it's FRNs and structured product, where the first question asked is number one, is it dependent on Libor? Number two, does it have fallback language now or not in terms of this legacy issuance? And number three, if it has a fallback language, well, what is that? Is it a proposed fallback rate like Fed funds? Is it simply to poll 3.5 dealers that are left standing after Libor terminates? So we have functionality like that on the Bloomberg terminal, as well as distributed as an enterprise product that does exactly that, where we've gone through about, I'd say, 10,000 corporate FRNs and some other products, syndicated loans, added these special data fields. We'll have another 10,000 on structured notes, and we're digging now very intently on structured products, CLOs, and things like that through the rest of this year. And then the last larger thread, and this touch, I guess, Eli, you started touching on this, but so I have a portfolio, and I'm asking the question, number one, I've identified what my fallback language is. Number two, I'm trying to get a handle on what it's going to morph to. What is that new rate or new instrument? And then one needs to do scenario analysis on, well, if I have a derivative position or cash position, they may have different triggers for fallback cessation, or they may just jump to differing fallback indices or mechanisms. Just one thing I skipped over very briefly, and that is the fallback. So on the derivative side, we've been elected as the calculation agent, in essence, to produce this fallback for Libor for, I believe, 7 currencies. The 8th will come on as Euribor and Eurolibor, and there's a little bit going on for Singapore SOR as well. So that in the derivatives market, this is already being kind of planted in place for derivatives.
So it's, maybe Ola, I could just ask you, so you talked about fallback, and at least as it relates to debt and maybe secured products or structured products. So unfortunately, the language usually leaves you with no answer, which is nobody's there to, swap out a rate. You need 100% consent to do it. So there's got to be an impact, whether it's the floating rate notes, but I know you have expertise in
Yeah,
structure.
sure. So, and echoing many of the points that were discussed here at Moody's, we're heavily trying to assess the exposure first. And the exposure in structured finance can come in 3 different flavors. You have the assets, liabilities, and then the derivative contracts. Any disruption in terms of with the transition, you may get basis risk shortfall. There could be some actual shortfall in certain transactions and in certain products. So we're focused on assessing or capturing the fallback language. And again, similar to technologies mentioned in terms of applying robotics to extract the fallback language. The challenge in structured finance that many of you may know is the variation in transaction documents, the number of transaction documents, and the inconsistency across different products and transaction documents. So we've been trying to tailor these capturing efforts, and in some cases, especially in the legacy contracts, unfortunately, it's a manual process due to either the lack of or the type of forms of the documents. The second step is really assessing the impact, and we have been running sensitivities specifically on transactions and products that could have an impact. So, and to your point, Link, in terms of where there are transactions that do not have a fallback language, that sensitivity testing is trying to capture what if something happens by, for example, hurricane spread of some sort. The concern that will still be somewhat unknown is the litigation risk and what could that bring in terms of cash flow disruptions. That is something, unfortunately, is going to be to the timing, and the sooner the market participants are close to making these decisions, that is something that could mitigate the risk of cash flow disruptions. The other risk or the other concern that everybody needs to look into in terms of the notification to investors, to rating agencies in terms of that transition, if there are amendments, if there are consents. Yep. Who's sending these documentation and who's capturing them? And to your point, who's databasing them? So there's a few things that are in terms of operationalizing this transition that we're looking into to make sure that we're able to react and proactively.
So can I ask a question? So I was going to ask, are you guys actually looking at the level of preparation in terms of issuers and banks? Because if you have 2 transactions that are exactly the same and they have the same fallback language, and maybe the fallback language needs a little bit of tweaking, and you have one issuer that's doing nothing, or one financial institution that's doing nothing, and one financial institution that's very prepared, you could see substantial chaos and sort of uncertainty and cash flow disruption going on in one and not the other. So it sounds like you are actually looking at some of the processes that are ongoing to prepare for the transition.
I can specifically speak on mortgages and RMBS since it's under my purview. So in mortgages, we're definitely in contact with servicers and what they're doing in terms of systems preparations. Many of the servicers, they do have a standardized systems. And so when it comes to the change on rate that may not cause disruption. Similarly, in terms of exposure of ARM collateral in mortgages, that is somewhat has become smaller post-crisis due to the modification. But we are definitely apprehensive in terms of looking at the various readiness of the various parties. In certain transactions like CLOs, you have the collateral manager who can be more proactive and much more easier to get answers in terms of the transition, rather than in consumer assets where, to your point, the party that needs to make that transition is either not identified or yet to be identified.
And you have the mismatch where clearly the underlying consumer loans are going to get amended and have a substitute rate. The overlying security, the RMBS, that's a big question mark to your point, Eli. And my guess is, a little bit of hope on the structured products, and is that a lot of them are, quote, programmatic, so single originator, if you will, and maybe in those cases, if there is a situation where they end up in court, and I think there's going to have to be a solution through the courts, they can come as a group, which makes life a lot easier versus the corporates, which are single issuers. There's really no way to join them as a group. So I think there may be a little less chaos, but it's still a huge question mark. Nobody really knows where it's going to end up to come up with a solution.
Yeah, we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but some of the downstream effects of not being prepared, or maybe being prepared upstream but not considering the downstream, can on the surface make it look like you're doing a lot, but then when it comes to reporting and investors' consumption of the information or just general data consumption, then it breaks down.
Yeah,
Yeah, you have to think about how you're physically going to get these documents to these external parties, right? What mechanism are you going to use, and what's the governance around that? And sort of start mapping out that workflow of where these contracts are, how many of them are there, and how are we going to physically do this workflow and get this work done.
And maybe that's a good time to bring up the point that even though this panel is called, technology and Libor transition or something, right? But at the end of the day, in most cases, technology is not the solution, right, to the problem. So I certainly speak to a lot of firms out there, a lot of clients or potential clients, and a lot of times what I'm hearing is this hope that technology will come in and somehow magically solve things. Right. Like, so there are some folks out there sitting kind of on the bench waiting for some magic, robot to come in and repaper all their contracts and notify all their investors and, modify all of their loans and so on. And in reality, technology that exists today in this universe today is really just, it's an enabler, it's a catalyst, right? It's a tool, and including some of the fanciest, AI, ML solutions that are out there. They have to have a very heavy, human component to run, and I would even argue that there are two pieces that are required. One is you need a lot of human hands and eyes on these documents, on these tools, to make them all work. Even AI, ML tools have to be checked and double-checked and trained and supervised. Ultimately, any of the actual renegotiations that happen are very heavily, human powered, right, today in this world. And also from a governance perspective, I find that it's very, very important to have the firm's governance processes set up in such a way that enable this process to happen, right? So you have to have the right infrastructure in place internally, you have to have the right buy-in from senior management, you have to have a process, a conveyor belt, so to speak. I think somebody mentioned this term, conveyor belt, so that the machine can be used in the context of having the right people using the right machines in the right process to get something done. So if you have those three pieces in place, then you have some hope of getting there by 2021. If you're hoping that technology will somehow do it all by itself, you're probably not going to get there.
Yeah, and that comes to planning. So basically, you're saying there's no such thing as Santa Claus?
Unfortunately, yeah. I know it will come as a surprise and a disappointment to some folks in the room.
Yeah, it takes the right subject matter experts. I mean, even if you have great machine learning, if you don't have the technical experts, it's not going to be a very good experience. You know, if you don't know the deal documents, it's very hard to apply good machine learning. So it really is an effort, and, you know, based on my own knowledge of various participants who have very large books that they need to get on top of, there are varying degrees of success, and those who have had to kind of tackle similar massive kind of engagements like this previously, they're kind of ahead of the curve because they have the knowledge base, they have the process. But there are going to be other institutions where they just don't have the right expertise, and they're going to have 300 people in a warehouse looking at documents as they approach the cutoff time.
You know, it's similar, I don't know if people are familiar with e-discovery and the e-discovery deadline, 2006. So e-discovery requires, you know, for the federal rules of civil procedure to collect information for discovery. So before that, you could get away with paper, and so people didn't prepare, and they ended up imaging file shares and hard drives, and you name it, resulting in terabytes of data that they would hold for e-discovery, primarily because they weren't prepared. And then they would pay security experts and other experts to cull through the stuff at huge amounts of money. And it's similar with Libor. There's not as much data, but there's a deadline, and there's lack of preparation. And I think those same ramifications are going to happen to organizations that don't plan.
And I know, Harry, you were mentioning, I know Bloomberg's going to take care of everything, and I think that's great.
Right.
Me personally.
That's why you're in the middle. You're like the hub.
But you mentioned that you guys are trying to post on, I guess, product by product, the actual fallback language, which is interesting because it's going to be a critical part, particularly in the debt world that I'm familiar with, to know what that language is.
Yes, so as I mentioned before, we went back at the original prospectus and source documentation, and to the extent that that information was available on the legacy paper, we are bubbling that up as data fields. If you're familiar with Bloomberg, if you're not, this is going to sound like a real infomercial, but you go to our DES screen, you look at the security, the coupon, the payoff, and if there is fallback language, we put it in there, yes or no fallback. If so, are 3 banks polled? Does it fall back to the last known Libor? There's a various sort of waterfall logic. So we're adding these fields, and as I said, we went through basically corporate FRNs first, and we're branching to other currencies and from US dollar, as well as to other, certainly structured product. The one thing I just want to mention is that I think is the fallback. We'll lay a lot of groundwork, and we're going to pump that out in the next couple of months or so. The is the fallback infrastructure, which essentially assigns a historical credit spread on top of OIS based on a 5-year look-back historical median. That'll be useful information in trying to assess where do you stand by going from Libor to risk-free. The last point I just want to make is just a global markets observation. I don't know if it's of interest to these parties, but I'll try it. But, you know, you had 400 trillion of Libor-based derivatives, and in it, it has a credit component and a risk-free component, credit liquidity component and a risk-free component. Now, by, I guess, regulator dictate, essentially, we're closing open interest on that spread. The spread is kind of condensed in sympathy for what people expect is the fallback is going to converge to, 20 basis points, 25 basis points. And you no longer have that sort of a movement of historical, or I should say of credit spreads, like the way we did during the credit crisis, where it blew out to 100, 200 basis points. So you almost have, by regulator dictate, a collapse of open interest on that credit derivative component. And I'm just wondering, I can't poll the audience, but I'm wondering if people are thinking about that. It's kind of an interesting thing, because if we all go to a risk-free world, where do you go to hit the bid to hedge your credit risk if and when you're going to need it? So it's just food for thought.
Well, maybe we have about 10, 12, 15 minutes. If anybody has a question in the audience, you know, yeah, gentleman in the back there.
The question has to do
I mean, I can speak for some of the banks. So I came out of a bank recently, a SIFI, and, you know, the SIFIs kind of had to go first for a variety of reasons. They're the most regulated, they have the biggest books. You know, the regulators are interesting when it comes to bank. They don't technically require, but they tell you what they think you need to do. So, and I know Eli and Alexia, you can talk to this, but, you know, the first and foremost is governance. They want to know that you have a process in place that goes right up to the board, that every line of business that can be impacted by LIBOR has their own sub-working group with their own governance process, that you're inventorying your contracts, and that you can show clarity to them that you're on top of it. I'm glossing over a lot, but to me, that sounds like the principal mandate that, you know, the bank regulators, certainly the Fed, is looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't personally talked to regulators about how they're going to approach this, but from past experience, I would say that sounds right. A robust process, you know, a task force to lead it, making sure there's a process in place and checks to make sure that people are actually following it, that it's standardized across the different business units and functional areas, and then to make sure that you've developed a process that makes sense in line with some sort of impact assessment. You know, that you've really identified the risk to the organization.
Yep.
And that you've planned for things that might happen that that require you to change plan a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like I mean, one thing that's a bit of a risk is that a lot of folks are waiting for guidance from regulators or for industry groups or from first movers. And what if the timing of that guidance doesn't come when you need it, right? I mean, institutions are going to have their own individual timelines if they're planning things well and their own milestones. They may need this data as an input to that. Or potentially even worse, the data comes and it's not the data you were expecting, right? The regulators say X when you were hoping for Y, and how are you going to deal with that? Or there's a first mover that just takes the lead and everybody kind of follows, and the regulators just kind of stand back.
'Cause the regulators haven't said precisely what financial institutions need to do. It's not,
Right.
There's some guidance
There's
out there.
guidance, but it's not a
If you
mandate.
visit the ARC, I'm not sure if you're a representative of a bank, but at least for the banks, ARC has published, I mean, super high level, like the 8 or 9
The
aspects.
checklist, yeah.
Yeah,
The ARC
right,
checklist,
exactly.
yeah.
And the proposed fallback language for structured finance.
But there's nobody saying to banks, you have to get off LIBOR at this time. They're saying it's prudent that you do. And so I think part of the fear is, what if they do all of a sudden mandate something and we're doing something else? Or there's a first mover and they're sort of setting the trend and the best practice, and we're not aligned. So I think a lot of banks are just holding back to see what
But
happens.
to that point, I think Freddie and Fannie recently announced that by the end of the year, they will not be accepting any ARM with
Right.
LIBOR. So in terms of first movement and how the market.
And Shell has
Yeah.
done a lot of work with
Yeah, so
SOFR as well.
every deal has to
Yeah.
have a
Right,
fallback to
right.
an alternate rate. You know,
Right.
the regulators aren't forcing, but if you're regulated, you know where you're gonna end up.
Yeah.
But maybe Alexia, if you,
Yeah, I have some data points on this. You know, through our ARC interaction, we have kind of regular contact with the regulators on this. And one thing I can say is that the regulator giveth and the regulator taketh away. So on one hand, with respect specifically to the legacy contracts, there is an initiative at the ARC level to try to provide some legislative relief. So there's some public information out there that you're probably aware of, where for the state of New York, there is a potential to push through some legislation that will deal with some of the fallback cases. Still doesn't cover all the fallback, all the legacy positions, and it doesn't solve all of the issues. And it is a state solution, so obviously New York is the key state for a lot of securities, but it's not the only state that matters, right? So it doesn't solve all of the issues. I said taketh away. Just yesterday there was a speech by Mr. Hauser, who's the head of markets for the UK Bank of England, And he actually took the opposite side of this equation. He basically said, that the Bank of England is considering increasing haircuts for capital purposes to 100% for any LIBOR-linked instruments starting at a certain point later this year. And the Bank of England is using that as a tool, kind of a combination of a carrot stick, right? So they're dangling some carrots that they're also using a stick to try to get institutions off of LIBOR as quickly as possible as part of a concerted effort there. So we will be seeing more of that coming out in the U.S. as well. There are some proposals for specific deadlines as to when folks need to start getting off of LIBOR, at least for new instruments. Won't necessarily solve the legacy issue, but we'll provide more impetus for the markets to move.
I think we may have time for one more question, if there's anybody who has a question. Okay. Harriet, you look like you had something you wanted to say.
No, I'd like to end on that note.
Just really quickly on the legislative solution, there's some question around that under the contracts clause of the Constitution, whether or not you can apply law retroactively to contracts. So even in that case, there's still some unknown. But anyway, that's the riddle of LIBOR, I guess. There's no clear solution at this point in time, but preparation's a big deal, and you should make sure you're ready. So. But with that said, thank you, and thank you, panelists. And thanks for everyone who stayed. We appreciate it.